Hello all, just a quick video for your lower sixth composition lesson today. We're going to be looking at orchestration, which is a bit of a change of tack from the kind of sonata series that we've been doing over the last few weeks. But I thought it might be worth just talking about this because I know one of you is working on an orchestral piece, but also it's something that again is just quite useful generally. So we're going to look at two orchestrations of Debussy's La Fille aux Cheveux de Lin, which is quite a famous piano piece and is one that's been orchestrated quite a lot, which is really useful because actually, looking at how different composers and arrangers have orchestrated a piece of music can inform our own approach to orchestration. So we're going to look at those two orchestrations, and yeah, hopefully we'll be able to draw out some sort of different approaches to orchestration that will be useful for forming our own kind of approach. Okay, so just before we begin, there are two kind of different ways of approaching orchestration. So one, the really traditional way of approaching orchestration is usually a way of kind of adding colour to a piece, usually towards the end of the compositional process or to a pre-existing piece. So this is basically what we're talking about with the Debussy. When composers and arrangers have come and orchestrated this piece, they're really, taking this piano piece and they are trying to find a way of adding different kinds of colour to that piece. So, in a sense, it's kind of like an arrangement. This is usually the kind of thing that we tend to think about when we're thinking about orchestration. In that this approach to orchestration covers the vast majority of traditional music, especially if that music relies very heavily on melody and harmony. The second approach to orchestration is one that becomes more common in the 20th century, particularly with our in our sort of innovations topic, and that's where orchestration becomes a more integral part of the compositional process, where the most important part is timbre and texture, the timbre and the texture of the sounds that you're going for. So, for instance, Ligeti's piece's Atmospheres is an example of a piece of music in which the orchestration, or actually, spreading the musical material across the orchestra, happened very, very early on, because it is an orchestral piece in like the truest sense of the word. What I mean by that is that if you, with a piece like Debussy, or with like, say, a Beethoven symphony, if I wanted to play a Beethoven symphony on the piano, it would be broadly recognisable. So I think this is, I think we broadly recognise that as Beethoven's Fifth. But if I wanted to try to play Ligeti's Atmospheres on the piano, I'd really struggle because that piece relies so heavily on the sound of an orchestra, the sound of that massive orchestra, that it really, really, really wouldn't be recognisable if I were to play it on the piano, because the timbre and the texture of the sound are such a massive part of the piece. Whereas with Beethoven's Fifth, the main part of the piece is the melody and the harmony and the rhythms and all of that. So you can do a thing where you rearrange that material. Okay, so there's sort of two ways of approaching orchestration. We're typically going to be talking about the first one today, and in fact, over the next couple of weeks. So that's where we're primarily focusing at first, but it's important to keep that second one in mind, because that second one to do with colour and timbre and texture is still something that needs to inform your decisions, even if you're taking the first approach. So let's move on. So here's the piece, here's La Fille aux Cheveux de Lin. I'll give it a quick playthrough at the piano, and just to kind of give you a sense of what it sounds like. So here it is. Okay, so there's the piece. I hope you recognise it. I think almost certainly you probably will recognise it. But if not, I think it's a really sort of nice, lovely kind of lyrical piece. So let's now just take a step and take a step forward and just think about how you might kind of think about orchestrating this prelude. How would you sort of orchestrate this piece? And in so doing, you might think about, well, what are the really important features of that piece of music? What are the things that really stand out? And then how would you, split those important features? How would you distribute those important features across the ensemble? How would you maybe take some of those chords and sort of spell them out across the strings or the woodwind? How would you treat the melodic material? Would you, pop that, that opening theme in the woodwinds? Would you pop that in the brass? Maybe you'd pop that in the strings. How would you use the percussion? Would the percussion have a kind of a supporting role in this, or would you try to make sure they had a bit more of a main role? And I think the answers to these questions really depend on the kind of sounds that you're really trying to draw out of this prelude. So it's always a really interesting. That's maybe like an interesting place to start. What kind of sound world do you want to create with the musical material that you have? So we're going to kind of proceed and look at two ways of orchestrating this. But before that, here are the kind of the important bits, some of the important bits that I've isolated. So for me, one of the most important bits is the passage right at the opening, that opening melody, which bounces from this top D flat down to the E flat, up to the D flat, down to the E flat. It's got this sort of monophonic texture. It's this really rather tentative opening because there's no sound in the bass. And, you know, it's just this sort of E flat minor 7 chord, which again isn't, you know, really tonally very strong. And the first sound in the bass is really delayed. It only happens right at the very end of the second bar, and there, at least at first, doesn't feel as though there's a strong sense of pulse. We have this sort of hocketing between the melody and accompaniment. Later on, the da-da-da, ba-dum, ba-dum. And then the sort of the climactic moment in the piece, where this sort of C flat major chord returns. And then the return of the opening melody over that really widely spaced, warm major chord. So those for me are like the really, really big important moments. Some of the sort of general features, the fact that the chords are always quite big and really spread out, that's something that you might want to draw upon in an orchestration of this piece. So let's have a look at a quite typical way of orchestrating this. This is an arrangement that I found on IMSLP. It's actually by someone called Maria Gill. But there's several arrangements by a wide sort of variety of sort of 19th and 20th century composers that all more or less do a similar kind of thing. So this is a very sort of typical way of orchestrating this prelude. And so here's the opening, and in this case the opening melody is treated as a kind of woodwind solo. We've got it here in the flutes, or in fact in the solo flute, against the rest of the woodwind ensemble that sort of covers the harmonic material. And then that melody moves into the clarinets. So here, basically. And when we're in the clarinets, the accompaniment changes, and it is covered by sort of the bassoons at the bottom of the texture, but mostly by the horns. So the horns cover the chords under the clarinets. Notice though that like the harmony parts are treated like a kind of choir in each section. So we've got a kind of woodwind choir going on here. So all of the harmonic material is in the woodwind section, and the chords move broadly, sort of homophonically, as you might expect in a choral texture. Also notice that in the brass, we've got a similar kind of thing. In the horns, I should say, because it is just horns here. We've got the whole chord just in the horns, and that feels very much like a kind of choral texture as well, because it's, you know, it's homophonic, the chords are all moving together. And that's a really typical way of orchestrating the harmony part, of having a section, whether it's the strings, the woodwind, or the brass, all kind of acting as a kind of choir, so that the harmony is covered. Later on in the piece, in that opening theme, we get several choirs kind of acting together for just the one bar. We've got our woodwind choir up here. We've got a sort of a string choir here that sort of takes the melody on, or sorry, takes the harmony on. And we've also got the harp, which sort of punctuates this particular moment. This is a moment towards the end of that opening theme. So we have this sort of we have this run. So you can see that the texture sort of opens up there, and because that's a relatively big moment, it's been orchestrated in a much thicker manner. There's a lot more going on than we had at the opening, where it was just the woodwinds and then just the sort of clarinet and horns. Okay, so we're going to kind of carry on. We're going to have a look at this sort of Hocketing thing. And here the Hocketing is treated actually in a relatively straightforward manner. It's just been spelt out across the strings, and it is just the strings in this section. We've got the melody, sort of the very top line of the piano part, in the first violins, and then the rest of the chord is spelt out in the seconds, violas, and cellos. That should say. Yeah. So it's really just. It's kind of spelt out quite nicely, and that's partly to do with the way Debussy has written this. You can see that he's written it as though it's in four voices, and so for this passage, the orchestration, it's almost done for you. You can just split those voices amongst, in this case, the strings, but you might choose to do that in the woodwinds. You might choose to do it in the brass, say. So that's basically how the Hocketing has been treated, and that's kind of how it's treated in a really sort of typical orchestral arrangement. So just moving on now to the climax of the piece in this arrangement, we've got that sort of really big chord, and again, this is actually the first time we hear all of the orchestra more or less all at the same time. So we've got this full orchestral sound. It's really big. It's really warm. And we've got this sort of really sort of widely spaced chord, but also notice that, again, we've got the entire chord in each section. So we've got the entire chord in the woodwind section, entire chord in the horns, again, the entire sort of chord in the harp, the entire chord here in the strings. So it's very much as though each section is acting as its own separate choir. I should say the bass is only appears in the harp and the bassoons, but overall the rest of the chord is across the whole lot. So fear not doubling a chord across different sections. It's really typical. It's actually really vital when you're orchestrating a piece of music, because that makes the harmony sound warmer. Okay, so there's the climax. And here's the return of the opening melody. So over that sort of big chord, that big held chord, we get, which is treated in the strings and the oboes and bassoons, we get, again, a solo flute melody over the top. Notice, though, the combination of oboes and bassoons. Those instruments are both double reed instruments, and they sort of have similar timbres, and so they combine really, really well. And that's something that we kind of bear in mind when we're developing, say, orchestral sounds or an orchestral palette. We want to find instruments that have a similar timbre, that are going to blend well together. So that's what this orchestrator has done. In choosing the oboe and the bassoons here and leaving out the clarinets, we get a really nice sort of unified, solid tone there to the chord alongside, or to support the sort of the strings. Another classic combination might be flutes and clarinets, which we kind of saw at the opening. We had the melody start off in the flute and then move down to the clarinet. And so because, again, those have got very sort of broadly similar timbres, that sort of move from one to the other wouldn't feel so jarring. Okay, so there's the really typical kind of way of orchestrating this this prelude. We're going to have a look at another orchestration by a composer called Colin Matthews. And so we're going to just look through some of the bits and bobs. So Colin Matthews orchestrates this prelude for just strings and two harps. That's it. And for me, Matthews really focuses on capturing the tentativeness of this prelude. It's got a really sort of lovely, gentle, lilting melody. And it doesn't feel particularly confident at first. The opening is marked, sans rigueur, which means sort of a bit loosely. We can play it, we can sort of play around with it, so it feels a little bit floppy, a little bit not so confident. And that, I think, is the kind of thing that Matthews is really focusing on. So he does that by extending the opening notes, like the opening D flat. We've got it across one whole bar of 4/4 here, and not only that, it sort of enters gradually. So we enter gradually through the second violins, and then through the first violins. The dynamics are quite important. We sort of enter in, we crescendo up to PPP, but from silence. So we start playing and gradually we come in. It's played consort, it's played with the mute, and there's very little sort of sense of pulse. So it's at a very slow tempo, and the way the instruments enter, even though it's in 4/4, it enters at a sort of a slow kind of minim triplet over the course of the bar. So yeah, it doesn't. Again, we get that real sense of tentativeness. We don't get a really strong sense of pulse, and as each sound enters, it's really only just there. And then when the melody appears, it's kind of staggered between the violin section. It doesn't appear all in one as it did in the first orchestration, where we had everything appear in the flute solo and then in the clarinet solo. In this case, it is split, but I'll sort of zoom in on that later and show you how that's accomplished. The bouncing between the D flat and the E flat in that opening theme is supported by the harp. So you can see here, the harp, first harp plays that D flat, the second harp plays an E flat, this E flat at the bottom of the tune, D flat, E flat. Those are played as harmonics to give it a bit more of a gentle timbre so that it's not so full on. But I think the reason why we need to have these attacks here is because when strings are played very quietly and they're played they're played slurred, it's often quite difficult to discern a separate attack amongst string instruments. They're very good at sort of blurring things together. And so by supporting those particular notes, the D flat and the E flat in the harp, we still get a sense of that bouncing between one to the other. Okay, so that's more or less what's going on. Here's how the melody is split between the strings. So you can kind of see we've got the opening bit here. We then go down to that E flat. Oh, sort of split those twos. I'm not sure what's happened there. We sort of go down to this E flat here. We're going back up to this sort of B flat to D flat, then to the B flat to the G flat here, and then down to the E flat. And you can kind of see how the melody is sort of fragmented across the first violins, the top two lines, and the second violins. So we've got the first fragment, the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth. Okay, so it is very much split, and that means that it doesn't feel very together, it doesn't feel very confident, and so it does feel a lot more tentative. Here's how the Hocketing section is treated, and again, we've got that sort of Hocketing between the different instruments. So in this case, we've got the violas and the cellos. The violas cover the right hand, the cellos cover the left hand. But instead of having one line, instead of retaining this line in a single instrument, that line is split between two separate instruments. So in this case, it's two solo violas. We've got that G flat A, B flat in the first solo viola. Then we come down to the B flat A, G flat in the second viola, and then G flat F, E flat back in the first viola. So there's that sense that we're sort of constantly bouncing between two separate instruments. It's a different way of thinking about this particular passage. In the first, it's more about getting that melodic line to come through. In the second, it's almost more about this Hocketing texture. And that's kind of the thing that Colin Matthews is trying to bring out here. More the texture than the tune. Good. Here's the climax of the piece, and actually this is dealt with in a relatively traditional manner because we've got the full sort of string section again. The full string section is playing together, so we finally get this really warm string sound, and we also get the harp kind of supporting the strings again by playing these big chords. So actually this is quite nice. This is, again, like the first orchestration, it's the only time, I think, in the piece that we actually hear the sort of the orchestration, the full orchestra. Cool. So moving on. Here we've got the return of the opening theme at the end, and actually now we're starting to get a little less sort of tentative. So the melody remains split across two solo violins, but there's much more of the melody in each part before it splits. So we actually get quite a lot of that first melody here, and then quite a lot of the melody in the rest of the section at the end of that particular melodic phrase. And that gives it a greater sense of confidence at the end. It's a much more different feeling. We also get the large sort of expansive chords split across the rest of the string ensemble. So we do get a sense that we do get a sense of that warmth at the end of the piece. Okay, so that's what's going on with the Colin Matthews. So how might you actually use this material? So just thinking really basically in terms of technique, the idea of each section acting as its own choir is really vital. It's a really very rookie error in orchestration to sort of place each note in a chord in one particular instrument and then not double it, because that can sound really thin. And I think sometimes when people orchestrate things as a beginner, I think the thinking is sometimes about placing one note in each particular place, and actually that's not the case. We've got to think about colour, and that often means placing the same note in multiple different instruments. But really, more importantly, you need to think right at the very beginning about what you want to emphasise in your orchestration. So, is it the tune? Is it the melody that you really want to emphasise, as the first orchestration did? It was all about keeping that melody front and centre, sort of in the woodwinds, and like have the rest of the ensemble really support that melody. Or do you want to do something like Colin Matthews did, where he makes his orchestration really emphasises the tenderness and the tentativeness of the piece by limiting his orchestral palette to just strings and harp and constantly splitting those melodic lines across the ensemble. Both of those are, two different approaches to the same piece, but they really draw out different sounds. They draw out different sound worlds, which are arguably in there, arguably sort of evidenced in that piece. And also, just another kind of a technical thing, you can use instruments to support the attack of others. So in the Colin Matthews, that was the harp. The harp was sort of playing the D flat and the E flat at the ends of the opening melody. But another really common way of doing that is to have sort of pizzicato double basses to emphasise sort of the beginnings of phrases, or to have kind of stabs in the brass, or in the lower woodwinds. That's a way that you can really kind of add an accent, sort of a textural accent to a particular moment. So those are three little things. There's actually probably a lot more in those orchestrations that you can draw out, but those are the three things that initially came to mind. So yeah, that's basically it. I hope that's useful. And again, as always, I'll send through scores and things. There is a recording of the Colin Matthews one on YouTube, but actually but actually there isn't a recording of that particular arrangement that we looked at on YouTube at the moment. There is a very similar one, so I'll send a recording of that through. Do give them a listen. And again, if there's anything that you really, really would like me to cover, if there's something that you're struggling with in particular, then do let me know, because I'm always happy to sort of try to pop something together for you guys. Okay, there we are. Thank you very much.